Untested, unpredictable and in some cases deadly. The explosion in new drugs, often known as legal highs, has become a major headache for governments across Europe. What's being done to protect the public? Welcome to On the Front Line.
This was intense. My heart's gonna go bam, 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 out my body. I think the tricks of the name, it felt artificial. This was wrong.
We tend not to call them legal highs, we tend to call them lethal highs.
New psychoactive substances exploded onto Europe's club and drug scene a decade ago. Unregulated and blamed for dozens of deaths, users rarely know what they're taking.
The first one was like a spice thing, but it was called critical mass. That was the cannabis marijuana substitute. I tried a second time. I got this packet of fake cocaine called China White, and I'd done that. Well, my heart was just beating at 1,000,000 miles per hour. I was like thinking to myself, this is too high. It didn't taste, it tasted a bit kind of like chemically. It was like, you could tell this wasn't right.
The mind-altering substances mimic illicit drugs like cannabis and cocaine. Hundreds have been identified. Many have been banned, but others are still openly sold. Experts warn such untested products pose a significant health risk.
These are chemicals that have been synthesized by the Chinese chemical industry and being sold and used as drugs, and they've not been tested by anybody anywhere. So the moment they hit the market, we know nothing about them at all.
In the UK, so-called head shops also get round the law by labelling products not for human consumption. But the British government has recently announced plans to outlaw such psychoactive substances and outlets. The move follows similar blanket bans in Poland and Ireland.
I think what we've seen in Ireland is actually if you take it out of the high streets, in main shopping areas, in what looks like a normal shop, actually it has had a massive effect on the availability of these drugs.
Despite such efforts to control supply, new variants of outlawed drugs continue to emerge in Europe at a rate of 2 a week. That not only keeps such products beyond the law, but also raises fears more harmful substances could appear. With me now is Paul Griffiths from the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, and Professor Volker Averta, a toxicologist from Freiburg University. Gentlemen, many thanks for being with us. Paul Griffiths, let me start with you. The EU's drug agency identified 101 of these new psychoactive substances last year. That's a record. Are these substances more dangerous and more addictive than traditional illicit drugs like cannabis and cocaine?
Well, yes, we're now monitoring nearly 500 substances, and to put that into context for you, that's almost twice as many drugs as are controlled under the international drug conventions. And are they more dangerous? Well, I think for many of them we simply don't know. They've never been tested on humans or animals. But what I can tell you is some of them can be very toxic. And, for example, the 6 substances that we looked at last year in terms of controlling in the EU, all of them had been associated with hospitalisations and deaths. And in many respects, there was aspects of their chemistry that made them more worrying from a public health point of view than the street drugs that they were replacing.
The nightmare scenario is that something particularly toxic could come onto the market. Are the systems in place to stop that if it happened?
Well, I mean, that's not just the nightmare scenario, that's the reality, I think, of the work we have at our agency now. We're particularly concerned about some very obscure chemicals. They may come onto the market very quickly. They might not be used by many people, but they may be very toxic. So it really is a challenge for us to identify and respond quickly on some of these more toxic and obscure chemicals.
What kind of toxic drugs are you coming across, Volker Averta?
Well, in Germany, the biggest problem is with synthetic cannabinoids. And, well, a main reason for that is that policy on cannabis is quite strict in Germany. So many people and many young people also tend to substitute cannabis use by these more dangerous drugs. Psychosis is also a common symptom which can also occur with cannabis in high doses. More problematic are the acute effects we see. So, for example, people vomit for hours, and at the same time they can lose consciousness and be in a comatose state. So this combination can be lethal.
OK, one of the main difficulties for governments is the global nature of this problem, with many of these drugs coming from outside the EU. Let's just take a look at this graphic. Manufactured by chemical companies based notably in China and India, the latest generation of chemically engineered drugs are shipped to Europe in bulk quantity, often via post. Once inside Europe, the substances are processed into legal highs, research chemicals and even food supplements. Marketed in bright, attractive packaging, the synthesised compounds are then sold openly in so-called head or smart shops or online. Evidence suggests 8% or nearly 1 in 10 young adults in Europe have tried a synthetic drug. Paul Griffiths, how do you respond to this when the market is so sophisticated, it's often online and it transcends borders?
As an agency, one of our concerns is to act as an early warning system so we can identify and target the most toxic compounds as they appear. And one of the real difficulties for member states is actually identifying these substances. So if we can share that forensic information, that can be a first step in addressing this problem. More generally, we've seen countries trying now to target the open sale of these drugs on the high street.
So we just saw in the report that the UK is looking to ban them. Is that an effective response?
Well, I think it is one response in this area, and what we have seen, it does seem to limit the availability and use, at least in the short term.
Banning them? Is that a way forward, Volker Werther?
I think to reduce availability by closing high street shops is a good idea, that's for sure. I don't know if it is really effective, because the online sale will go on in most of the cases.
You're not going to stop people wanting to take drugs. Is there any way that these new psychoactive substances could be sold and used safely?
We've seen no European country going down that avenue to date. I think there has been some discussions on that in New Zealand, but they find it very difficult to come up with a safety regime. And one of the problems is dosing. Something can be safe if you take it infrequently in a very low dose, but if people use it in a much larger dose, it's going to be much more problematic.
Do you think some of these drugs could be licensed?
I'm also not sure if it would work, but facing these problems, we have to find creative solutions, I think, because the old modes of action seem not to work anymore. We see new drugs, and some of them are really much more dangerous than the ones we had in the beginning.
So in effect, you're saying that banning them is making the problem worse?
In a sense, yes.
What would you say to that?
We see many of these substances are highly problematic. We've seen substances that are highly toxic, and I think really the idea that they can be sold on the high street without any form of regulation is going to be very difficult to support.
You're seeing some of these new sort of designer drugs which are more harmful than, say, cannabis, ecstasy. Should those traditional illicit drugs be legalised so these new drugs don't get onto the market?
I think you have to look at the specific situation in a specific country. So in some countries, you really have the problem that people substitute illegal cannabis use by legal synthetic cannabinoid use, which is much worse. And in that situation, I think politicians should react and try to reduce the harm. And that could be to make cannabis a legal option.
Your agency has just launched a report. What are you seeing in terms of traditional drugs like cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy? What's happening in the wider drugs market in Europe at the moment?
Overall, the situation is quite stable, although we see differences in some countries. What we have seen in the last year is that the purity of many of the synthetic drugs out there is getting stronger, and also the purity of the cannabis available is getting stronger.
Are these sort of legal highs, designer drugs having an impact on the traditional illicit drug market?
I think the concern for us now is we've actually seen some synthetic opiates appearing on the market in the last year, and they're competing with drugs like heroin, and in parts of Eastern Europe they've actually displaced heroin from the market, and people are injecting them and having very serious health consequences.
What would your advice be to anybody thinking of dabbling in these new drugs?
people who want to try these drugs should really inform themselves. Without having information on the drugs, nobody should use it, because that's really taking a very high risk.
People should be aware they're experimenting with substances that we know nothing about their long or short-term risks. And often the people selling them won't even know the substances that are in the packets they're selling. So they're really acting as guinea pigs, trying out substances that nobody understands the health consequences of. And that's something that should be avoided.
Do you see an immediate sort of end to these new drugs?
I think this is going to be a problem that's going to be with us for a while now. It's very much linked to the global nature of the world we're living in, and what we've seen in terms of production now outside of Europe is going to be very difficult for us to control from a European perspective.
OK, no easy answers. Gentlemen, thank you both very much. That's it for this edition of On the Frontline. You can find us on social media as well as euronews.com. Until the next time, thanks for watching.